Hello, and welcome. I'm glad you've chosen to settle in for a while. What you're about to hear is not a story of heroic conquests or dramatic transformations. Instead, it's an exploration of small decisions. Decisions made centuries ago by people who believed they were addressing temporary problems, never imagining that their solutions would persist into the distant future. In many ways, history is shaped not by the grand gestures we remember, but by the quiet permanence of the mundane. When a medieval magistrate introduced a new tax to fund a military campaign, he likely expected it to end when the campaign concluded. When a craftsman's guild established rules to protect their trade, they probably assumed these regulations would eventually fade as circumstances changed. When a village constructed a fortification for protection, few could have predicted it would define the community's identity for 800 years. Tonight, we're going to examine this curious phenomenon, the things that medieval people created as temporary solutions, thinking they were solving an immediate problem, only to watch those solutions calcify into permanence. Some became the foundation of modern institutions, others simply lingered, half forgotten, woven so deeply into the fabric of society that removing them became unthinkable. Imagine yourself, if you will, as we prepare to step back into this world, a world of stone and soil, of decisions made by candlelight, of institutions that grew from seeds planted with the most practical of intentions. Take a breath, settle in. Let your mind move at the pace of the medieval world, where change happened slowly, and yesterday's emergency sometimes became tomorrow's tradition. This is a journey into the surprising permanence of the temporary. And like all good journeys, it's best taken slowly. To truly understand why temporary became permanent, we must first understand the world in which these decisions were made. The medieval world was, above all else, a world of rhythms, natural rhythms that governed nearly every aspect of human existence. Imagine yourself in a market town in the year 1250. The morning begins as it has begun for generations, with the sound of the church bell marking the canonical hours. The bell, that simple bronze instrument suspended in stone, announces not just prayer times, but the structure of the day itself. It divides time into manageable, predictable units. For the craftsmen opening their shutters, the farmers moving toward the fields, the servants lighting fires in grand halls, the bell's voice is as constant as hunger itself. The streets, if you can imagine them, are narrow and winding. They seem to have grown rather than been planned, following the natural contours of the land, the accidents of history, the random placement of buildings erected over decades. There is no grand design visible here. Instead, there is merely the accumulated decision-making of hundreds of individuals, each solving their own immediate problem, building where land was available, where water was accessible, where a previous structure had stood. Yet this accidental arrangement would persist for centuries, these winding streets remaining largely unchanged even as the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, and eventually to the modern city. The marketplace itself operates according to customs so old that no one remembers when they began. Certain goods are sold in certain locations, the fishmongers near the water gate, the clothmakers in their guild hall near the center, the leather workers at the town's edge, where the smell of their trade wouldn't offend the sensibilities of those in the marketplace proper. These arrangements were made for practical reasons, often temporary ones. Perhaps the fishmongers were placed near the water gate because that's where the fish arrived, and it made sense to unload them there. Perhaps the leather workers were relegated to the town's periphery because of the stench of their vats, a nuisance that was always intended to be temporary, solved someday by better technology or more space. Yet here they remain, centuries later, their locations no longer serving the original purpose, but still respected as tradition, as the way things have always been. In the rhythm of weekly life, market day arrives with its own momentum. Typically held once or twice weekly, market day brings a surge of energy and commerce. But even market day follows rules established centuries earlier, often codified in a town's charter. These rules specified when the market could operate, which goods could be sold, which craftspeople had the exclusive right to sell certain items. Many of these regulations began as temporary measures to maintain order during the chaos of commerce, or to prevent fraud and monopolistic practices. We'll restrict who can sell cloth for 5 years, a town council might have decided, until we can train more quality assessors and ensure standards. Yet 5 years passed, and the restriction remained. Then 50 years passed, and the restriction had hardened into law, into tradition, into identity. The rhythm of seasons, too, governed medieval life in ways we moderns can scarcely appreciate. Spring was a time of intensive agricultural labor, from plowing through sowing, with every able body needed in the fields. Summer brought growth and often, food security. Autumn was an intense period of harvest, with the entire community mobilized to bring in crops before the weather turned. Winter was a season of relative rest, though certainly not idleness, when the work shifted from the fields to the household, the workshop, the market. The preservation and storage of food, the mending and creation of clothing, the repair of tools and buildings, these occupied the darker months. This seasonal rhythm meant that labor, too, was often temporary and cyclical. Young people left rural villages to seek work in towns during the slow winter months, returning in spring for planting. Craftsmen took on temporary apprentices during busy seasons. Temporary housing was constructed for workers during harvest. Temporary tax levies were imposed during wartime to fund soldiers and supplies. The entire medieval economy was built around these temporary arrangements, yet many would eventually become permanent fixtures of society. The household itself, whether a simple peasant cottage or a grand lord's manor, operated according to patterns and hierarchies that seemed eternal but were often, in their origins, quite practical and temporary. A young person might join a noble household as a servant, intending to stay for 7 years, save some money, then return home or seek better employment elsewhere. Instead, many stayed for life, their temporary position becoming a permanent role. Over generations, servant families became attached to particular households, their temporary employment hardening into hereditary service. The positions themselves accumulated duties and regulations. The scullery maid shall arrive at dawn, the steward shall manage the stores, the cook shall prepare 3 meals daily. Rules that began as simple instructions for managing a specific household but gradually became the template for every household in the region. The guild system, which would become one of the defining institutions of the medieval and early modern world, grew in many cases from temporary cooperative arrangements. In the 11th and 12th centuries, when craftspeople first began gathering together in towns, the arrangement was pragmatic and often assumed to be temporary. A group of cloth makers might agree to set standards for their craft to prevent shoddy work from damaging their collective reputation. This was a temporary agreement, made while the craft was still relatively new to the town. A group of stonemasons might agree to pool their resources during a major building project and then disperse when the work was complete. Yet slowly, these temporary associations became permanent guilds, with formal structures, written regulations, and governmental authority granted by the crown or the town. What began as, "Let's all work together on this cathedral," became, a century later, "No one may work stone in this city without permission from the Masons' Guild." The temporary had become permanent through sheer repetition and utility. Consider the very structure of towns themselves. Medieval towns typically grew up around some central point, a castle, a monastery, a crossroads, and expanded outward from that core. In many cases, early town walls were hastily constructed during periods of conflict or instability. We need to protect ourselves from raids, the townspeople decided, so we'll build a wall. Once the trouble passes, we can take it down, or at least not maintain it so carefully. Yet once a wall was built, it became extraordinarily expensive and difficult to remove. It defined the boundaries of property ownership, determined which roads could be widened or improved, constrained the growth of the town itself. What was meant to be temporary protection became a permanent feature, not because it was always needed, but because removing it was more disruptive than maintaining it. The wall became not just a physical structure, but a symbol of the town's identity, and you cannot simply dismantle a symbol. The same logic applied to many other temporary structures. A garrison of soldiers stationed in a region for a specific conflict would remain long after the conflict ended, becoming the nucleus of a permanent military installation. A tax imposed to fund a crusade or a war would persist after the campaign's conclusion, becoming the foundation of the medieval state's regular revenue. A religious order founded to address a specific spiritual crisis, the poor needed feeding, the sick needed caring for, would over generations become an institution controlling vast lands and wielding political power. The temporary response to a crisis had hardened into permanent structure through the simple physics of institutional inertia, and perhaps most importantly, there was the matter of habit itself. The human mind is a creature of pattern and routine. Once something has been done a certain way for long enough, and long enough in the medieval world might be only a generation or two, a mere 20 or 30 years, it begins to feel natural, almost inevitable. The younger generation, who cannot remember a time when things were different, simply accepts the existing arrangement as the natural order. They have no reason to question it, no motivation to change it, and significant inertia working against any change. If you've grown up knowing that clothmakers have a guild, that there are rules about market day, that the town has a wall and a garrison, that certain jobs run in families from father to son or mother to daughter, then these things feel less like historical accidents and more like features of the natural world. This, then, is the landscape in which our story unfolds. It is a world where decisions, made for immediate practical reasons, accumulate and solidify into permanence. It is a world where the temporary and the permanent are often indistinguishable, where an emergency measure of one generation becomes the foundation of the next. And it is into this world, with its rhythms and its patterns, and its quiet accumulation of the temporary, that we must now venture to examine specific examples of things that were meant to be temporary but never went away. The stage is set. The rhythm of medieval life pulses around us, the bells marking time, the seasons turning, the market day crowds gathering, the workers beginning their tasks. And within this world, embedded in this rhythm, we will find our stories. To understand how the temporary becomes permanent, it helps to follow a specific story, a story that is played out in various forms across medieval Europe. It is the story of an emergency, a solution, and the slow calcification of that solution into something far larger than anyone intended. Let us travel to England in the year 1194. Picture yourself in Westminster, in the royal palace where governance happens in a building that smells of old stone, rushes on the floor that haven't been changed in weeks, and the faint mustiness of parchment and ink. It is here, in rooms lit by narrow windows and tended by servants who move quietly through the shadows, that King Richard the Lionheart's administrators are facing a problem that feels, to them, absolutely urgent and utterly temporary. Richard has just returned from crusade, or rather, he's in captivity in the Holy Roman Empire, and his kingdom must ransom him. The sum required is enormous, 150,000 marks of silver. To put this in perspective, this amount exceeds the entire annual royal revenue. It is an emergency unlike any the kingdom has faced in living memory. The administrators know, with absolute certainty, that this is a temporary situation. Once Richard is ransomed and returns, and surely he will return soon, this crisis will be over. The emergency measures they implement now will be just that, emergency measures, to be dismantled as soon as the immediate crisis passes. Yet what they decide to do in this moment of crisis will reshape English governance for centuries. The problem, simply stated, is this. The king's traditional revenue sources, feudal dues, rents from royal lands, occasional levies, are insufficient. To raise money quickly and efficiently, the crown needs to assess the wealth of the entire kingdom. And so the administrators decide to implement something new, a systematic tax on movable property. Every subject with any wealth must declare what they own, their animals, their goods, their household items, and pay a percentage to the crown. This tax is presented to Parliament as a temporary measure. This is for the ransom, the justices explain. Once the king is free, this tax will end. It is given a name that reflects its temporary nature, a lay subsidy or sometimes an aid. Language that emphasizes it is a one-time grant from the subjects to their king in a moment of crisis. The administrators who implement it are probably thinking in terms of months. Surely the ransom will be paid within the year. Surely life will return to normal. To actually collect this tax efficiently, The Crown needs administrators. Local officials must be appointed to assess property in each county, each town, each village. These officials must be trained. They must learn how to conduct inventories, how to question people about their possessions, how to record information accurately. They must understand the rules of assessment. Should livestock count? Should tools of trade? Should the clothes on someone's back? These questions must be answered consistently across the entire realm, which means the Crown must issue detailed instructions, must train officials, must create a system. And here is where the temporary begins its slow transformation into the permanent. This system, once created, is extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. Even if the ransom is paid and the tax is theoretically ended, the administrative infrastructure remains. The officials trained to conduct assessments are still there. The procedures for collecting taxes are now understood and documented. The records that have been created, showing who has what property, what each village is assessed at, what each region contributes, are valuable. They can be used for other purposes. They can be repeated, and repeat they do. The tax ends as promised. Richard returns eventually, and the emergency is over. Yet within a few years, the Crown faces another crisis. There is another war. Another ransom must be paid. Another emergency. And what do the administrators do? They reach for the tool they've already created. They implement the lay subsidy again. This is temporary, they say again. Just for this emergency. But each repetition makes it less temporary. Each time the system is used, it becomes more refined, more efficient, more deeply embedded in the expectations of both the Crown and the people. By the 13th century, what began as an emergency measure has become a regular, if still intermittent, source of royal revenue. By the 14th century, it has become expected. By the 15th century, it is simply part of how the kingdom is governed. The temporary tax has become, for all practical purposes, permanent. Though it is still theoretically granted by Parliament, still theoretically temporary, still theoretically subject to the approval of the realm's subjects. But the fiction of its temporariness has become just that, a fiction. The substance is permanent. Yet the story does not end with taxation. The administrative apparatus created to assess and collect this tax eventually becomes something much larger. To conduct these assessments fairly, the Crown needs reliable local officials, and to ensure these officials are loyal and competent, the Crown begins to regulate who can hold these positions. Training standards emerge. Oaths of office are required. A bureaucratic hierarchy develops, with officials at the national level, regional level, and local level, all communicating with each other, all following the same procedures. This, in many ways, is the birth of the modern state. What begins as a temporary emergency measure, we need to raise money quickly to ransom our king, becomes the foundation for modern governmental structure. The temporary assessment becomes the permanent census. The emergency tax becomes the foundation of regular state revenue. The ad hoc officials become the professional bureaucracy. Now imagine the perspective of a local official in, say, 1250. He has been appointed to assess property in his county. He has been trained by the Crown. He understands the rules. He keeps records. He reports to his superiors. He might think of this as a temporary position, something he does for a few years until the emergency passes and he can return to his previous occupation. But his son, watching this, sees something different. He sees a position of some prestige and regular income. When his father retires, the son takes the position. It becomes hereditary, or at least family property. The temporary becomes a career. The emergency measure becomes a family tradition. Or consider the perspective of a merchant in a market town. When the assessment comes around, he must declare his goods. He resents it. It intrudes on his privacy. It requires him to spend time with royal officials. It results in a tax he must pay. Yet he also understands the logic of it. The king needs money for a war, he thinks. This is fair enough. Everyone pays their share. The temporary measure, because it is repeated, because it is presented as fair, because it serves a comprehensible purpose, gradually becomes accepted. By the time the merchant's children are grown, they simply assume that periodic assessments are a normal part of life. The emergency has become routine. And what of the records created during this process? This is perhaps the most significant and least obvious aspect of the story. When the Crown conducts an assessment of property, it creates a record. This record shows, in some detail, who owns what in each region. It shows which areas are wealthy and which are poor. It shows which families are rising and which are falling. It shows patterns of land ownership and resource distribution. These records are extraordinarily valuable, not just for taxation, but for understanding the realm itself. And so the Crown keeps them. They are filed away, preserved, consulted, and as records accumulate over decades, they become a historical archive. They become a tool for governance that extends far beyond taxation. They can be used to settle disputes, to verify claims of nobility, to understand the distribution of resources, to plan military campaigns. What began as a temporary emergency measure, let's write down what everyone owns so we can tax them fairly for this emergency, has become the foundation of governmental record-keeping, of historical documentation, of administrative memory. The temporary has not only persisted, it has become indispensable. This same pattern, emergency measure, repetition, gradual institutionalization, hardening into permanence, played out across medieval Europe, in France, in the Holy Roman Empire, in Castile and Aragon. Kings facing similar crises created similar systems. Some of these systems were more successful, more efficient, more deeply embedded than others. But in all cases, the temporary became permanent through a process so gradual that no one could point to a moment and say, "Here, at this moment, we decided this would be forever." Instead, it simply happened, through the accumulated weight of repetition, habit, and institutional inertia. And so, we arrive at a curious historical truth. Many of the foundational institutions of the modern state, tax collection, census-taking, bureaucratic hierarchy, record-keeping, professional administration, originated not in grand legislative moments, not in carefully planned reforms, but in emergency measures taken centuries ago. The permanent was built, brick by brick, from the temporary, until no one could remember a time when things were different. The medieval administrators who first implemented the lay subsidy could never have imagined that their emergency measure would shape governance for centuries to come. They were solving an immediate problem. They were responding to a crisis. They were buying time until life returned to normal. Yet by solving that immediate problem effectively, they created something that would outlast them, outlast the king they served, outlast the kingdom they governed. They created permanence from emergency, institution from improvisation, tradition from crisis. And in doing so, they exemplified one of the deepest patterns of human history, that our most enduring structures often originate not in careful planning, but in desperate adaptation. If you were to walk through the old quarters of a European city today, perhaps Bruges, or Florence, or Cologne, you would notice certain buildings that seem to belong to no particular era. They are sometimes grand, sometimes modest, but they share a curious quality. They feel oddly purposeful, as if constructed for a very specific, now forgotten function. Many of these buildings are guild halls, and within their walls lies a mystery that has puzzled historians for centuries. How did institutions that were meant to be temporary, practical responses to specific problems, become so deeply embedded in the fabric of medieval and early modern society that they persisted for 5, 6, or even 7 centuries? To understand this mystery, we must first understand what guilds were at their inception. Not what they became, but what they actually were when they first emerged. The earliest guilds were not the rigidly hierarchical, tightly controlled institutions we often imagine. Instead, they were loose associations of craftspeople doing similar work. A group of weavers in 12th century Flanders, for instance, might have informally agreed to maintain certain standards of work. Why? Because their reputation was collective. If one weaver produced shoddy cloth, buyers might avoid cloth from that town altogether. The temporary solution was practical and communal. Let's all agree to produce good work so we all benefit from a good reputation. Similarly, a group of masons working on a cathedral project might agree to pool resources, share tools, and work according to a common standard during the construction. Once the cathedral was complete, the agreement would naturally dissolve. Everyone would move to the next project, the next town, the next opportunity. The temporary association would end because its purpose was accomplished. Yet, something curious happened. In some regions, these temporary associations did not dissolve. Instead, they began to formalize. By the 13th century, in many cities, craft guilds had become official bodies, chartered by the crown or the town council. They had written rules, elected officers, the power to fine members for violations, the authority to exclude non-members from practicing the trade. What was meant to be a temporary practical arrangement had become a permanent institution with governmental authority. But how did this transformation happen? The answer lies partly in the visibility and success of the system itself. A town with well-organized guilds that enforced quality standards became known for producing good products. Buyers sought out goods from that town. The economic success was real and measurable. And so, other towns began to imitate the system. What worked in Bruges was copied in Ghent, then in Antwerp, then in towns across Europe. The temporary solution became the standard solution because it worked. Yet there is more to the story than simple efficacy. The guilds also offered something else, something that made them attractive to both craftspeople and town authorities. For craftspeople, the guild provided community, mutual aid, and a degree of economic security. If a weaver fell ill, the guild might support him. If a mason was injured and could not work, the guild provided assistance. If a widow was left alone, the guild might help her children learn the trade. The temporary association had evolved into something that resembled a mutual aid society, a social safety net, a family. For town authorities, guilds offered something equally valuable: control. A town council could regulate the guilds, set standards, ensure that craftspeople contributed to the defense of the town or the maintenance of its walls. The guild masters could be held responsible for the quality of goods and the behavior of their members. The temporary, practical arrangement had evolved into a mechanism of governance. And here is where the mystery deepens. How did these institutions persist, even when their original purpose had long since faded? By the 15th century, the quality control function of guilds was less important. Markets were larger, reputation traveled more easily, competition itself regulated quality. By the 16th century, the mutual aid function was being replaced by other institutions: formal poor relief, hospitals, religious confraternities. By the 17th century, guilds were often seen as obstacles to innovation and efficiency, restricting who could practice trades and preventing new techniques from spreading. Yet they persisted. They persisted because they had become embedded in law, in custom, in identity. A craftsman's identity was tied to his guild. A town's governance structure included the guilds, the physical architecture of the city, the guild halls, the marketplaces reserved for guild members, the streets named after guilds, embodied the guild system. To dismantle guilds would have meant dismantling not just an institution but a way of life, a sense of community, a structure of authority that had existed for so long that no one could quite imagine life without it. The guild halls themselves are physical testimony to this embedding. Consider the Guild Hall of the Weavers in Bruges, a magnificent building constructed in the 14th century. It stands on a central square, a building of stone and brick that speaks of permanence and importance. Inside, there are meeting rooms where guild business is conducted, storage areas for tools and materials, sometimes housing for the guild master. The building itself is an investment, a declaration of permanence. You do not construct such a building for a temporary arrangement. By the time the guild hall is built, the guild has stopped thinking of itself as temporary. It is now and forever. Yet if we could speak with the guild members of the 12th century, when guilds first emerged, they would have looked at such a building with incomprehension. Why would we construct such a thing? They might ask. This is temporary. We are only organizing ourselves until the problem is solved. But the problem was never fully solved, or rather it was replaced by other problems, other reasons for the guild to persist. This is the mystery at the heart of the guild system. It persisted not because anyone chose for it to persist, but because it became embedded in so many aspects of medieval and early modern life that dismantling it became nearly impossible. And in this way, The temporary had become permanent through the simple accumulation of layers of law, custom, architecture, economic interest, social identity, and institutional inertia. To understand this better, let us examine what historians have discovered in the archives of guild records. In cities across Europe, guild documents have survived, preserved in town halls and church archives, offering glimpses into how these institutions actually functioned over time. And what these documents reveal is a picture of constant, subtle evolution, not a sudden transformation from temporary to permanent, but a slow drift, a gradual hardening, a process so gradual that those living through it might not have noticed. The earliest guild documents are often simple and brief. A charter granting a guild permission to organize might be only a few lines long. The craftspeople are permitted to meet, to establish rules, to fine members for violations. There is no sense of permanence in such documents. They read like practical solutions to practical problems. But as the decades pass, the documents become more elaborate, rules proliferate, procedures are established, appeals processes are created, penalties are standardized. The guild begins to develop a bureaucracy, a structure that resembles less a temporary association and more a governmental entity. And once such a structure exists, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. The bureaucracy has its own momentum. Moreover, the guilds themselves became conservative institutions over time. A guild that had been established in the 12th century, that had achieved prosperity and influence by the 15th century, would naturally resist changes that might disrupt that prosperity and influence. The guild masters of the 16th century were not trying to preserve a medieval institution. They were trying to protect their own interests, their own wealth, their own power. Yet in doing so, they preserved the institution, even as its original purposes faded into irrelevance. The survival of guilds also depended on something less obvious, the sheer difficulty of creating alternatives. Suppose a town council in the 15th century decided that guilds were outdated and should be abolished. What would replace them? Some mechanism for enforcing quality standards would still be needed. Some institution for organizing craftspeople would still be useful. Some way of integrating craftspeople into the civic structure would still be necessary. In the absence of obvious alternatives, it was simply easier to maintain existing guilds than to create new systems. This pattern, the persistence of institutions not because they are loved or thought to be ideal, but because they are convenient and because alternatives are unclear, is remarkably common in human history. We often think of institutions as things that are deliberately chosen and maintained. But in reality, many institutions persist because the cost of dismantling them exceeds the cost of maintaining them, because alternatives are unclear, because people are accustomed to them, because powerful interests benefit from them. And so, the guilds persisted. They persisted through the Renaissance, when some of the greatest achievements of human creativity were produced within guild structures. They persisted through the Reformation, when religious institutions were being radically reorganized. They persisted through the rise of nation-states and centralized monarchies. They persisted through early industrialization, gradually losing power and influence, but not disappearing entirely. Some guilds, in modified forms, still exist today. In our modern world, we might call this institutional path dependency. The idea that once a system is established and embeds itself in the broader social structure, its persistence becomes nearly independent of its original purpose. But to the medieval craftsman, it would have seemed like something simpler. This is just how things are done. This is tradition. This is the way of the world. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all, how easily and completely the temporary becomes invisible, becomes taken for granted, becomes tradition. How a solution to a problem 500 years old continues to structure our lives, not because we have chosen it or because we believe in it, but simply because it is there, because it is familiar, because its removal would disrupt too many other things. The guild halls still stand in European cities, beautiful buildings that serve other purposes now, museums, concert halls, government offices, but they stand as monuments to a curious truth about human institutions, that our most enduring structures are often not those we have carefully planned, but those we have stumbled into, and then, through the simple acts of repetition and habit, have allowed to become permanent. To truly understand how the temporary becomes permanent, we must examine not just institutions, but the social structures and obligations that bound medieval society together. And to do this, we must look at life from two very different vantage points, from the great hall of a noble manor, and from the small cottage of a peasant farmer. For it is in the contrast between these worlds, and in the strange permanence of the obligations that connected them, that we find perhaps the most profound example of temporary arrangements calcifying into systems that would persist for centuries. Let us begin in the great hall of a manor in the year 1150. Picture the space, high-ceilinged, with a great stone fireplace at one end, long tables where the lord and his family and favored guests sit to eat. The air is thick with wood smoke, rich with the smell of roasted meat, stale from the rushes on the floor that have not been changed in weeks. Servants move silently through the space, tending to fires, bringing food, clearing away bones and scraps. The lord sits at the high table, a man of perhaps 40 years, with land holdings that extend across several villages. He is wealthy by any standard of the time, but he is also anxious. Anxious about the stability of his position, anxious about threats from neighboring lords, anxious about the reliability of those who owe him service. This anxiety, more than anything else, is what drives the system we are examining. The feudal system, in its essence, was a practical response to a specific problem. In the centuries following the collapse of centralized Roman authority, there was no strong state to maintain order or protect people from violence. Local strongmen, those who could afford to build fortifications and maintain armed men, provided protection. In exchange, those they protected owed them service and loyalty. It was a transaction, theoretically temporary, theoretically conditional. I will protect you, and you will support me. If the lord failed to protect, the obligation was theoretically voided. If the protector was strong enough, the obligation could theoretically be dissolved if one found a better protector elsewhere. Yet by the 12th century, what had been theoretically temporary and conditional had become permanent and hereditary. A peasant's grandfather had owed service to a lord, therefore, the peasant owes service to that lord's heir. The lord's grandfather had held certain lands, therefore, the current lord holds those lands, whether or not he is particularly effective at protecting them. The temporary arrangement had calcified into a permanent hierarchy. But how did this happen? The answer lies partly in the sheer difficulty of alternatives. Imagine yourself as a peasant farmer in 1150. Your family has worked the same plot of land for generations, under the protection, real or nominal, of the local lord. You know the rules of your obligation. You know approximately how much service you owe, perhaps 3 days a week working the lord's fields, or perhaps a set amount per year. You know when to pay your rents, at harvest time, in grain, or at Christmas, in cash if you have it. These obligations are burdensome, certainly, but they are predictable, and predictability in a chaotic world is valuable. Now imagine trying to escape this arrangement. Where would you go? To another lord's lands? But that lord would have similar claims on you. To a town? But towns were small, and they too had strict regulations about who could live there and what work they could do. To the forest and outlawry? Possible, but dangerous and precarious. The temporary obligation to your lord had become, through sheer circumstance, permanent, not because it was deliberately made permanent, but because the alternatives were worse. And so, across generations, the temporary became accepted as permanent. The lord's son inherited not just his father's lands, but his father's authority over the peasants. The peasant's son inherited not just his father's fields, but his father's obligations. The system persisted not because anyone had decided it should be permanent, but because it was easier to maintain than to change. Yet there is something more subtle happening here as well. The feudal system, despite its evident inequalities, offered something that made it psychologically bearable, a sense of mutual obligation. The lord owed protection to his peasants, the peasants owed service to their lord. It was not equal. The lord benefited far more from the arrangement than the peasants, but it was reciprocal. There was a concept of fairness embedded in the system. The lord should not demand more service than was customary. The peasants should not refuse service that was owed. When the system worked as intended, it created a kind of social stability. People knew their place. People knew their obligations. The world made sense. From the perspective of the Lord in his great hall, the system appeared even more reasonable. A lord did not think of himself as oppressing peasants. He thought of himself as protecting them, as maintaining order, as fulfilling obligations inherited from his father and owed to his heirs. The peasants owed him service, he owed them protection, and, in times of famine or hardship, some measure of support. The temporary arrangement had evolved into a moral system, a code of honor, a way of understanding the world. Now let us shift our perspective and imagine ourselves as a peasant in one of the Lord's villages in 1150. Your cottage is small, built of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof that leaks during heavy rains. The interior is dim, there is only one small window, and it is often shuttered against the cold. The air inside is thick with smoke from the fire that provides heat and allows you to cook. There is no chimney. The smoke simply filters out through the roof, or doesn't, filling the space with acrid haze. Your day begins before dawn. There are animals to tend, perhaps a cow, certainly chickens, possibly a pig. The animals are your livelihood, and they must be cared for before anything else. As the sun rises, if it is a day, you owe service to the Lord. You make your way to his fields. If it is not a service day, you work your own small plot. The work is monotonous and physically exhausting. Your back aches from bending. Your hands become calloused and cracked. Your feet, often bare or in crude shoes, are perpetually wet and cold in winter. The smell of your world is the smell of earth and animal manure, of your own sweat, of smoke. The taste in your mouth is often stale. Bread that has been stored too long, occasional meat from a pig killed in autumn and preserved, usually some kind of pottage made from vegetables and grain. The rhythm of your life is not the rhythm of ambition or achievement, but the rhythm of survival. Survival through seasons, through illness, through years, and woven through all of this is the obligation to your Lord. 3 days a week, or whenever he calls depending on the arrangement, you must leave your own work and go work his fields. During harvest the obligation intensifies. You must drop everything and bring in his grain first before your own. This is not presented as optional, it is presented as the natural order of things. Your grandfather owed this service, your father owed this service, and now you owe it, and your children will owe it. But here is the remarkable thing. Despite the evident exploitation in this arrangement, most peasants probably did not think of it as temporary. For them it was simply how the world was. They were born into obligation, and they expected their children to be born into obligation. The system had become so completely embedded in their understanding of reality that alternatives were literally unimaginable. And yet, from the perspective of the 11th and 12th centuries, this was not how it was supposed to be. In the early medieval period, there had been more fluidity, more opportunity for negotiation, more possibility of change. But as the centuries passed, what had been negotiable became customary. What had been customary became law. What had been law became nature. This transformation was reinforced by the Church. The Catholic Church in medieval Europe was not just a spiritual institution, it was a social institution that sanctified the existing order. Priests taught that God had ordained a hierarchy. The Lord ruled over the peasants just as the king ruled over the Lord, just as God ruled over all. To rebel against this order was to rebel against God himself. What had begun as a practical arrangement, you protect me, I serve you, had been transformed into a cosmic principle. The temporary had become divinely ordained, and the Church benefited from this system as much as anyone. The Church held vast lands, worked by peasants. The Church collected tithes, a mandatory tax on agricultural production, from every parish. The Church was invested in the stability and permanence of the feudal order, and so, from pulpits across Europe, priests reinforced the message: this is how God has ordered the world. This is justice. This is natural. But let us consider something else, the strange resilience of obligation itself. Even when the feudal system began to deteriorate, Even in the 14th and 15th centuries, when it was losing its military function and economic justification, many of its obligations persisted. Peasants still owed service to lords, even though the lord no longer provided meaningful protection. Peasants still paid rents, even though the terms were becoming increasingly onerous and less reciprocal. Why did these obligations persist? Part of the answer is legal and institutional. The obligations were written into law, enforced by courts, sanctified by tradition. Changing them required challenging both the law and the established order, which was extraordinarily difficult. But part of the answer is psychological and social. People are creatures of habit. A peasant who had paid rents to the Lord his entire life, just as his father had, and his grandfather before him, would continue to pay those rents, even if the Lord no longer provided the service that theoretically justified them. The obligation had become disconnected from its original purpose, yet it persisted. It persisted because it was what people expected. It persisted because alternatives were unclear. It persisted because the accumulated weight of centuries made it seem inevitable. Consider a specific example: labor. Rents. In many regions, peasants owed the Lord a certain number of days of work per year. These labor rents had originated from a practical arrangement. The Lord needed help with his fields, and peasants provided that help. In exchange, the Lord's protection supposedly made it possible for the peasants to have fields of their own. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, this arrangement was making less and less sense. The Lord often did not need peasant labor. He could hire workers if necessary. The peasants desperately needed more time to work their own fields, which would have provided more food and more security than working for the Lord. Yet the obligation persisted, even in regions where labor rents were becoming economically irrational. They persisted because they were traditional, because they were encoded in law, because challenging them meant challenging the entire social order. It was not until the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries after the feudal system had ceased to make economic sense, that labor rents finally disappeared across most of Europe. And they did not disappear because someone decided they should, but because the cumulative weight of peasant resistance, economic change, and the rise of new forms of authority made them untenable. The temporary obligation, which had hardened into permanence in the 12th century, took until the 18th century to finally dissolve. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of all. The temporary does not become permanent only through institutional mechanisms and legal structures. It becomes permanent through the gradual transformation of psychology, through the embedding of obligations so deeply in people's understanding of reality that they seem natural, inevitable, ordained by God or nature itself. The peasant who owed service to his Lord did so not just because the law required it, but because he had never known a world in which he did not owe service. The Lord who demanded service did so not just because the law allowed it, but because he had never known a lordship that did not collect such service. And so, we arrive at a curious paradox. The most permanent institutions are often those that are least questioned, because they have become so embedded in how people understand the world that questioning them seems impossible. The temporary had not just become permanent, it had become invisible, and that invisibility was perhaps its strongest guarantee of permanence. If you were to walk through the old city quarters of Europe today, you would be walking through a landscape shaped by decisions made centuries ago, decisions that were meant to be temporary, yet left physical marks that have proven far more durable than the intentions behind them. The stones themselves tell a story of the temporary made permanent, of emergency measures that became defining features of entire communities. Let us begin with something that seems straightforward: the medieval city wall. Today, in cities like Bruges, York, or Nuremberg, these walls are tourist attractions, beloved features of the cityscape, reminders of a romantic medieval past. But imagine, if you will, the perspective of someone living in the year 1180, when such a wall was first being constructed. The city is under threat. Perhaps there are raiders from neighboring territories. Perhaps there is political instability, rival lords competing for power, mercenary armies moving through the region. The town council meets and makes a decision: we must build a wall. It will be expensive, certainly. It will require the labor of countless workers. It will disrupt daily life, but it will protect us from immediate threats. "We will build this wall," the council probably said, "until the situation stabilizes. Once the danger has passed, we can dismantle it or let it fall into disrepair." This is a reasonable decision. It addresses an immediate problem with a practical solution. No one in that town council, watching the first stones being laid, intended to build a permanent fortification. They intended to build a temporary defensive structure. Yet something curious happened. Once the wall was built, it became extraordinarily expensive to remove. The stones could not simply be carried away. They were heavy, and the labor required would be substantial. More importantly, removing the wall would require destroying property. Buildings had been constructed against the inside of the wall, relying on it for support. Property ownership had been organized around the wall's presence. To remove the wall would mean disrupting property rights, displacing people, dismantling structures. But more than practical obstacles, there was something psychological at work. A wall, once built, becomes a symbol. It becomes the boundary of the city. It becomes a marker of identity. People begin to think of the city as defined by its walls. Merchants outside the walls want to trade with merchants inside. Craftspeople want to set up shops near the gates. The wall, which was meant to be temporary protection, has become the defining feature of the city itself. And so, the wall persists. Generations pass. The original threat that prompted the wall's construction is forgotten, or becomes historical, or is replaced by different threats. But the wall remains. It is maintained, partially, inconsistently, but maintained nonetheless. When enemies do come, and enemies always eventually come to medieval cities, the wall is there, whether anyone still remembers why it was built. Over centuries, the wall becomes more than a defensive structure. It becomes the container of the city's identity, the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between order and chaos. The idea of removing it becomes not just practically difficult, but psychologically impossible. The wall defines what the city is. To remove it would be to unmake the city. This pattern repeated across medieval Europe. Walls built in response to specific threats became permanent features of dozens of cities. They shaped urban development. They constrained growth. They determined where gates were located, which in turn determined where the most profitable trades would cluster. They influenced how water flowed through the city, where markets could be held, how armies could move. A temporary defensive measure became the foundation upon which entire urban systems were built. But walls are only one example. Let us consider something else, the layout of medieval streets themselves. Medieval cities rarely had planned street systems. Instead, streets developed organically, following the terrain, the accidents of history, the locations of important buildings. A cathedral might be built at a crossroads, which then became the center of the city. A market might establish itself in a clearing, and the streets would eventually orient themselves toward that market. A stream might determine where water mills could be placed, and the mills would attract craftspeople, and the craftspeople would settle nearby, and streets would develop to serve those settlements. In many cases, these streets began as informal paths, people simply walking the same routes repeatedly until a path emerged from the grass. Then, as the city developed, these paths became formal streets. Property boundaries were established along the streets. Buildings were constructed. The informal path had become a permanent street, with legal status, with ownership implications, with constraints on how it could be used. Now consider what this means: a street that originated as an accidental path, maintained by people walking repeatedly, became a permanent feature of the city's layout. And once streets are established, they are extraordinarily difficult to change. To widen a street requires acquiring property from owners on both sides. To create a new street requires destroying existing buildings. To change the fundamental layout of the city would be to overturn centuries of property rights, tradition, and accumulated structures. And so medieval cities retained their winding, inefficient, accident-prone street layouts long after those layouts had ceased to serve any practical purpose. In fact, the layouts often actively hindered the city's functioning. Streets were too narrow for modern commerce. Traffic became congested. Sanitation was difficult. Yet the streets persisted because changing them was more disruptive than maintaining them, because they were traditional, because alternatives would require dismantling too much of the existing city. Many of these medieval street patterns persist even today. If you map a modern European city, you will often find that the oldest districts still follow medieval street patterns. Tiny, winding streets that make no sense from a modern perspective, yet that define the character of the city and that people have become attached to. The temporary accident of history has become the permanent structure of the city. But there is something else embedded in medieval streets and buildings. The marks of temporary solutions that became permanent constraints. Consider, for instance, the phenomenon of jettied buildings where the upper stories project out over the lower stories, hanging over the street. This feature originated as a practical solution to a specific problem. Medieval property taxes were often based on the width of the property at ground level. A building owner could increase the usable space inside his building by having the upper stories project out, creating more interior space without widening the ground level footprint, and thus without paying higher taxes. This was a clever trick, a temporary way of beating an inconvenient tax system. But once builders began doing it, it became standard practice. The projecting upper stories became an expected feature of urban architecture, and because so many buildings had them, the entire street became characterized by these overhanging buildings, creating shadowy, enclosed streets where sunlight rarely reached the ground level. Over centuries, this temporary tax avoidance measure shaped urban design. It created the distinctive architectural character of many medieval cities. It made streets darker and dampier. It created conditions favorable to disease and plague. It altered how people moved through cities, how commerce happened, how the urban environment functioned. A temporary solution to a tax problem had become a permanent feature of urban life, with consequences that nobody had anticipated. We see this pattern again and again in medieval urban architecture. A temporary solution to a specific problem becomes a defining feature of the built environment, which then constrains future development, which then shapes how people live and work. Or consider the curious history of guild halls and their locations. In many cities, guild halls are located in specific positions, sometimes clustered together, sometimes spread across the city. These locations often originated from temporary necessity. Perhaps the Weavers' Guild Hall is located near a river, because the guild needed access to water for their craft. Perhaps the Tanners' Guild is located on the city's edge, because the stench of their vats made them unpopular, and they were literally pushed to the periphery as a temporary accommodation. Yet over time, these temporary locations became traditional, then permanent. The Weavers' Guild became so associated with that location near the river that it became impossible to imagine them elsewhere. The tanners remained on the periphery long after their craft had changed and the smell had diminished. The locations had become embedded in the city's identity and its economic structure. Perhaps most remarkably, in some cases, guild halls remained in the same location even after the guild itself had ceased to function or had moved elsewhere. The building itself, which had been built to house a temporary association, persisted as a physical structure even after the institution it was built for had vanished. This points to something profound. The permanence of physical structures far exceeds the permanence of the institutions they house. A building can last for 5 centuries. An institution might function for 5 centuries, but it might also be radically transformed or disappear entirely. Yet the building remains, shaping how people use space, constraining what is possible, reminding people of things long forgotten. Let us consider as well the curious history of medieval fortifications in a broader sense. Beyond city walls, there were countless smaller fortifications, towers, gatehouses, fortified bridges, palisades. Many of these were built in response to specific threats. A raid by Vikings prompted the construction of a tower. A threat from a rival lord prompted the construction of fortified gates. A flooded river prompted the construction of a fortified bridge to control crossing. These structures often outlasted the threats that prompted them. A tower built to defend against Viking raids might stand for centuries after Viking raids had ceased. The continued maintenance of these structures, even after the original threat had passed, consumed resources that might have been used for other purposes. Yet communities continued to maintain them, often without fully understanding why. There was a story, perhaps. Our ancestors built this to defend against raids, but the story itself became less important than the habit of maintenance. The structure existed, so it was maintained. It was maintained, so it continued to shape movement through the landscape, continued to require resources, continued to define the community's relationship to space, and in some cases, these temporary defensive structures influenced the development of communities in unexpected ways. A fortified bridge might become a toll point, generating revenue for whoever controlled it. That revenue might attract merchants who would settle near the bridge. A town might develop around the fortified bridge. What began as a temporary defensive measure had become the nucleus of a permanent settlement. This is perhaps the most subtle aspect of how the temporary becomes permanent. The physical structural embedding of temporary decisions so deeply into the landscape that alternatives become unimaginable. A wall defines a city. A street layout determines commerce patterns. A fortification becomes a settlement. A tax avoidance measure shapes urban character. The temporary decision, embodied in stone and timber, outlasts the institution that made the decision and the threat that prompted it. And long after the original purpose has been forgotten, the structure remains, constraining what is possible, channeling human activity in certain directions, shaping how people understand and move through their world. The temporary has not merely become permanent, it has become invisible, so thoroughly embedded in the physical landscape that it seems not like a choice, but like a feature of nature itself. Walk through the old quarters of European cities today, and you are walking through a landscape built by temporary decisions made centuries ago. The walls, the streets, the buildings, the fortifications, they all originated in practical responses to immediate problems. None of them were intended to be permanent. Yet here they remain, defining cities, shaping lives, constraining possibilities. And this, perhaps, is the most profound permanence of all. Not the permanence of institutions, which can eventually be reformed or abolished, but the permanence of the physical world, which shapes institutions and can only be slowly, painfully, partially changed. If we have learned anything so far in our journey through medieval history, it is that temporary solutions to immediate problems have a curious way of embedding themselves into the fabric of society. But there is another dimension to this phenomenon that we have only touched upon: the economic consequences of these temporary measures, and how they accumulated over generations to create permanent disparities of wealth and power. To understand this, we must think like a medieval merchant or craftsperson, and follow the logic of economic incentives across time. For it is in the realm of economics, where individual decisions made for practical reasons compound over decades and centuries, that we see perhaps the clearest example of how the temporary becomes permanent. Let us imagine a specific scenario, one that played out in various forms across medieval Europe. In the year 1180, a town council faces a problem. Commerce is becoming chaotic. Merchants are setting up stalls wherever they wish. Standards for weights and measures are inconsistent. Disputes arise frequently about quality and fair dealing. The council decides to implement a temporary solution. They will designate a specific location, the market square, where merchants must conduct business. They will appoint an official to oversee the market, to ensure fair weights and measures to settle disputes. They will charge merchants a fee for the right to sell in the market, a temporary tax to pay for the official's salary, and the maintenance of the market infrastructure. This is a reasonable decision. It addresses real problems. The fee is modest, perhaps a penny per day for a merchant's stall. The system is presented as temporary, designed to last until the market becomes more stable and these services are no longer necessary. But now, let us follow what happens over the next century. First, something immediate occurs. Merchants begin to cluster in the market square. Why would they not? The official ensures fair dealing. Disputes are settled. Customers know where to find merchants. The stall fee, though it was intended as temporary, quickly becomes accepted as a normal business expense. Merchants factor it into their calculations. Some merchants pay the fee and prosper. Others cannot afford the fee, or cannot secure a stall in the increasingly crowded market square, and they struggle. Over time, the most successful merchants are those who can afford to maintain stalls in the official market. They gain reputations, establish regular customers, build networks with other merchants. Some of them begin to acquire property near the market square. Perhaps they build permanent shops. Perhaps they acquire warehouses. The temporary market fee has created an incentive structure that concentrates commerce in a specific location and benefits those merchants who can afford to operate there. Now, let us skip ahead 50 years. The market is now well established. The council that created it is long gone. But the market square remains, and the fee remains. The fee is no longer temporary in anyone's mind. It is simply part of how commerce works. Merchants expect to pay it. The town council has come to depend on the revenue from the fee. Property values near the market square have increased, benefiting those who owned land there when the market was first established. But something else has happened. The market has become exclusive. New merchants, trying to break into trade, find that stalls in the official market are expensive, and they are not always available. Some markets create formal lists of eligible merchants. To become eligible, you might need to be the son or apprentice of an existing merchant. You might need to pay a substantial entry fee. The temporary fee to regulate the market has gradually evolved into a barrier to entry, limiting who can participate in commerce. Over another 50 years, by the year 1280, the situation has solidified. Certain families have become wealthy through generations of commerce in the official market. Other families, who lack the capital to secure stalls, or who arrived in the town after the best locations were claimed, struggle in the margins. The temporary decision to create an official market with a modest fee has, over a century, created a permanent economic hierarchy. Now let us consider a related phenomenon, the guild system, from an economic perspective rather than an institutional one. Guilds, as we discussed earlier, began as temporary associations to maintain quality standards. But from an economic perspective, guilds were something else. Mechanisms for controlling labor supply and maintaining prices. A guild that restricted who could practice a trade was, in effect, restricting the labor supply available to perform that trade. Fewer workers meant higher wages for those who were guild members. Higher wages meant higher costs for goods, which meant higher prices for consumers. Again, this was not necessarily the intention when guilds were first established. The intention was quality control and mutual aid. But the economic consequence of restricting labor supply was to benefit existing guild members at the expense of both consumers and would-be workers who were excluded from the guild. Now imagine that you are born in 1200, the son of a weaver who is a master in the Weavers' Guild. You learn the trade from your father. You are accepted into the guild. This is easy for you because you are the master's son. You establish yourself as a weaver. You marry a woman whose father is a merchant. You accumulate some wealth. You use that wealth to acquire property, to expand your workshop, to buy better tools. You have sons. By 1250 you are prosperous. You have used your position in the guild to build wealth. Your sons inherit not just your workshops and property, but also your position in the guild. They can become weavers easily, because they are the sons of a master weaver. Now imagine that you are born in 1200 in the same town, but you are the son of a landless laborer. You have some skill with your hands. You would like to learn weaving. It is a respected trade, and weavers earn decent wages. But to become a weaver, you must become an apprentice. And to become an apprentice, you must pay a fee. The fee is substantial, more money than you could ever hope to accumulate. Even if you could pay it, there are no apprenticeships available this year, because the Weavers' Guild has decided that there are already enough weavers. So you cannot become a weaver. Instead, you become a general laborer, earning lower wages, with less stable employment. By 1250, you are still poor. You work odd jobs. You have no steady income. Your children will likely be poor because they lack the connections and capital needed to break into a skilled trade. This divergence, from the same starting point, two people arriving at very different economic outcomes, has been created not by ability or talent, but by the accident of birth into a family that was positioned to benefit from a temporary system that became permanent. Over centuries, this pattern compounds. The descendants of the master weaver from 1200 accumulate wealth. They use that wealth to acquire property, to educate their children, to establish connections with other wealthy families. The descendants of the landless laborer from 1200 remain poor, restricted by barriers to entry into skilled trades, unable to accumulate capital, trapped in low-wage precarious employment. The guild system, which began as a temporary solution to quality control problems, has become a mechanism for concentrating wealth and power in the hands of those whose ancestors had the luck to be in the right place when the system was established. The temporary has become permanent, and in doing so, it has created permanent inequalities. But there is more to the story. These inequalities of wealth translate, in medieval society, into inequalities of political power. A wealthy merchant can influence the town council. He can ensure that policies favor merchants like himself. He can secure favorable tax treatment. He can ensure that his son receives a good position in the town administration. The temporary economic arrangements have created permanent political advantages, and these political advantages further entrench economic advantages. A wealthy merchant, through his influence on the town council, can ensure that new regulations favor established merchants over newcomers. He can support the creation of new barriers to entry. He can ensure that his guild remains powerful and exclusive. This is a feedback loop. Temporary economic arrangements create wealth disparities, which create political power. Disparities, which create the ability to make new temporary arrangements that further entrench wealth and power disparities. Over centuries, what began as a practical solution to a specific problem has become a system that perpetuates itself, that resists change, that seems increasingly like a natural and inevitable part of the world. Consider as well the phenomenon of urban-rural economic divergence. Many medieval cities grew wealthy through the concentration of trade. The temporary decision to create an official market in a city, for instance, attracted merchants and craftspeople. These people spent money in the city, which attracted more people, which created a virtuous cycle of growth. Meanwhile, rural areas, lacking this concentration of commerce, grew more slowly or stagnated. Over centuries, this initial advantage for cities, created by temporary decisions about where markets would be located, compounded into permanent economic divergence. Cities became wealthier, more powerful, more able to influence events. Rural areas became poorer, less powerful, more dependent on cities. A peasant born in 1200 in a prosperous city region had better prospects than a peasant born in a rural backwater, not because of any inherent difference in talent or ability, but because of temporary economic decisions made decades or centuries earlier that had accumulated into permanent differences in regional prosperity. Or think about the phenomenon of road and bridge development. In the early medieval period, roads were poorly maintained, bridges were few. Some lords, for practical reasons, invested in better roads and bridges on their lands. Perhaps a lord built a bridge across a river because his peasants needed to cross it to reach the fields. Perhaps he improved a road because merchants traveling through his territory were more likely to stop and spend money if the roads were in good condition. These investments were sometimes temporary, made for immediate practical reasons, sometimes with the expectation that they would eventually be recouped through tolls or increased trade. But they had permanent consequences. The areas with better roads and bridges attracted more commerce. This commerce generated wealth. Wealthy regions could afford to invest in further infrastructure improvements. Poor regions, lacking wealth to invest in roads and bridges, fell further behind. Over centuries, what began as temporary infrastructure investments by individual lords had created permanent geographic inequalities in wealth and development. Some regions became prosperous trade hubs, other regions remained isolated and poor. A merchant born in a prosperous region had enormous advantages over a merchant born in an isolated region, advantages that were created by temporary decisions made long before either merchant was born. And here is perhaps the most profound economic consequence of the temporary becoming permanent: the perpetuation of inequalities across generations. When temporary systems become permanent, they often become hereditary as well. The right to practice a trade becomes hereditary. The son inherits his father's position in the guild. The right to operate a market stall becomes hereditary. It passes from father to son. The right to collect tolls from a bridge becomes hereditary. It becomes part of a lord's landed possessions. What was supposed to be a temporary right or privilege, granted to an individual for a specific purpose, becomes a property right, a form of wealth that can be inherited. And once something becomes heritable property, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to remove. To eliminate the guild's control over a trade would require taking away property rights that families have held for generations. To eliminate tolls on a bridge would require confiscating income that a family has depended on for centuries. The temporary has not merely become permanent. It has become property, has become wealth, has become the inheritance of children who never made the original decision and who cannot remember why it was made. And so, across medieval and early modern Europe, we see economic systems that perpetuated themselves not through continuous choice or deliberation, but through the accumulated force of generations of inheritance. A merchant in 1500, collecting tolls from a bridge built by his ancestor in 1250, probably did not think of himself as collecting a temporary tax. He thought of himself as exercising a property right. The bridge was his, the tolls were his. This was simply how the world worked. The temporary had become so embedded in economic reality, so thoroughly naturalized, that it seemed not like a choice, but like a fact of nature. And in the process, it had created permanent hierarchies of wealth and power that would persist, in modified forms, into the modern era. We have spent our journey through medieval history examining how the temporary became permanent, how emergency measures hardened into institutions, how practical solutions calcified into rigid systems. But we would be incomplete in our understanding if we did not consider what happened next, how, eventually, after centuries of seeming immutability, these permanent structures began to crack, to shift, to change. For permanence, it turns out, is never quite as permanent as it seems. The temporary measures that became permanent were not invulnerable. They were subject to the same forces that shape all human institutions, the pressure of changing circumstances, the accumulation of grievances, the emergence of new possibilities, and the simple, grinding wear of time itself. Let us begin with something deceptively simple: fatigue. Imagine yourself as a merchant in a prosperous European city in the year 1450. Your family has been merchants for generations. You belong to the Merchants' Guild. You pay your fees. You follow the guild's rules. You are comfortable, relatively prosperous. The system works for you, or at least it works well enough that you do not think much about it. But imagine, now, that you are a merchant's son in the same city, born in 1440. You grow up in a world where the guild's restrictions seem less like protections and more like limitations. You see opportunities outside the guild, trading with distant lands, dealing in goods not controlled by guilds, using new techniques that the guilds resist. The guild system that felt natural to your father feels increasingly constraining to you. Over time, across a generation or two, this dissatisfaction accumulates. Young merchants chafe against guild restrictions. They seek ways to work outside the guild. They advocate for reform. Some of them leave the city entirely, seeking places where guild restrictions are less rigid. Others challenge the guild directly, sometimes through legal channels, sometimes through subterfuge or outright defiance. This is the beginning of the end for the guild system. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow wearing away as the system that once seemed inevitable begins to seem arbitrary, limiting, worth resisting. Similar patterns unfolded across medieval and early modern Europe. Feudal obligations, which had seemed permanent and natural for centuries, began to seem increasingly burdensome and irrational as economic conditions changed. Why should a peasant owe labor service to a lord when he could earn better wages working for himself or for wages? Why should a lord demand service that the peasant could no longer afford to give? The system had made sense when lords provided genuine protection and when there were no alternatives. But by the 15th and 16th centuries, alternatives existed. Central states were consolidating power, providing protection that had once been the lord's exclusive function. A market economy was developing, offering wage labor as an alternative to feudal obligation. The permanent system had not changed, but the conditions that justified it had changed entirely. And so, across the early modern period, feudal obligations began to dissolve. In some regions they were formally abolished through legislation. In others, they gradually fell away through a process of negotiation and custom erosion. Peasants refused to perform labor service, and lords lacked the power to enforce compliance. The obligation that had seemed permanent for 5 centuries faded within a few generations. But the process was not uniform or smooth. It was uneven, contested, gradual. Some regions clung to feudal structures longer than others. Some lords adapted, converting labor obligations into cash payments. Others resisted fiercely, seeking legal enforcement of ancient claims. The erosion of permanence was a process of conflict, negotiation, and slow change. Consider the phenomenon of urban riots and uprisings. In many medieval cities, the most prosperous guild members had come to dominate city government. The Merchants' Guild would control the city council. The Weavers' Guild would have disproportionate influence. New craftspeople, struggling against guild restrictions, would have little voice in governance. Over time, resentment built, and occasionally that resentment exploded. In 1378, in Florence, the Ciompi, the woolcarters, who were not recognized as a formal guild, rose in rebellion against the established guilds that dominated the city. For several months, they briefly seized control of the city government. They abolished some of the most oppressive guild restrictions. They were eventually defeated, but their rebellion demonstrated something important. The permanent systems that seemed immovable could be challenged, could be shaken, could be partially dismantled through organized pressure. The Ciompi rebellion was not unique. Across medieval and early modern Europe, there were periodic uprisings against guild monopolies, against feudal obligations, against urban restrictions that benefited established elites. These uprisings rarely succeeded permanently in overturning the systems they challenged, but each one weakened the systems, exposed their arbitrary nature, demonstrated that they were not inevitable, and perhaps more importantly, these uprisings and challenges had a cumulative effect on the psychology of those living under these systems. If the permanent system could be challenged, could be temporarily disrupted, could be partially reformed, then it was not truly immutable. The seeming inevitability of the system was revealed as something more fragile. And once you realize that a system is not inevitable, once you recognize it as a human creation rather than a force of nature, the possibility of change becomes imaginable. This is perhaps one of the most important prerequisites for actual change. The psychological shift from accepting something as inevitable to recognizing it as contingent, as subject to human will, as potentially alterable. And this shift often comes not through argument or ideology, but through the concrete experience of challenge and resistance. Consider as well technological change. Many of the restrictions imposed by guilds and feudal systems made sense in one technological context, but became absurd in another. A guild that restricted who could practice a trade made sense when training was lengthy and required direct apprenticeship. But as knowledge began to be transmitted through written manuals and printed books, the guild's monopoly on training became less justifiable. A feudal obligation that made sense when lords provided the only available military protection made less sense once centralized states had established standing armies. Technology changed not because it was designed to undermine guilds or feudalism, but simply because new techniques became available. Yet these new techniques inevitably undermined the justifications for the permanent systems. Over time, as technologies changed, the rationale for these systems became increasingly difficult to defend. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, was particularly revolutionary in this regard. The printing press made knowledge widely available. It made it possible for people to learn trades without requiring access to guild apprenticeships. It made it possible to challenge established authorities by distributing criticisms widely. It did not intentionally attack guilds or feudal systems, but by changing how knowledge was transmitted and how ideas circulated, it undermined the foundations of these systems. But perhaps more fundamentally, the permanent systems began to collapse because the world they were designed for no longer existed. Guilds and feudal obligations had made sense in a world of local, self-contained communities with little long-distance trade and few alternatives to local protection. But from the 14th century onward, the world was changing. Trade routes were expanding, distant cities became interconnected, new forms of political organization, centralized nation-states, were consolidating power. the permanent medieval systems were increasingly out of step with an increasingly interconnected, mobile, dynamic world. A merchant in 1350, who wanted to trade with Flanders and Italy, had to navigate a complex maze of guild restrictions, feudal obligations, and local regulations in each region. By 1550, this maze had not been entirely eliminated, but it had become more fragmented, less effective, easier to evade. The permanent system was breaking down not through deliberate reform, but through the simple inability to maintain control in a world that was becoming too complex and mobile for medieval institutions to manage. And perhaps most importantly, the permanent systems began to lose legitimacy as the historical memory of why they had been created faded. A feudal obligation that your great-grandfather accepted as a temporary emergency measure might have seemed worth maintaining. But a feudal obligation whose original justification had been forgotten, that served no apparent purpose, that was enforced by lords who could no longer credibly claim to be providing the protection that supposedly justified the obligation. Such an obligation became increasingly hard to defend or maintain. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the permanent medieval systems were facing not just challenge from below, but intellectual challenge from above. Reformers, humanists, and thinkers began to question the foundations of feudalism, guilds, and the permanent restrictions that medieval systems had imposed. They could not necessarily overturn these systems directly. Institutional inertia remained powerful, but they could delegitimize them. They could argue that these systems were not inevitable, not natural, not justified by anything other than historical accident and the inertia of the powerful. And in doing so, they opened the possibility for change. Once a system is recognized as arbitrary rather than natural, it becomes vulnerable. It becomes imaginable that it could be different. And once it becomes imaginable that it could be different, change becomes possible. The actual dissolution of these medieval systems took a long time. Feudal obligations persisted in some regions into the 18th century. Guilds maintained power in some trades well into the 19th century. The permanent had become so deeply embedded that it took centuries of pressure, challenge, legislation, and cultural change to finally dislodge it. But the direction was clear. What had seemed permanent was beginning to move. The French Revolution, in many ways, was the culmination of centuries of pressure against medieval permanent structures. The revolutionaries, consciously and deliberately, abolished feudal obligations. They abolished many of the guild restrictions. They sought to create a new society based on rational principles rather than historical accident. Whether or not they succeeded, and historians would argue about that, they at least demonstrated that the medieval permanent systems could be deliberately dismantled, that change was possible on a large scale. But there is something poignant in this history of dissolution. The systems that were established as temporary solutions to immediate problems, that hardened into permanence through the accumulated weight of centuries, that seemed immutable and inevitable, turned out to be vulnerable after all. They turned out to be subject to the same pressures that shape all human institutions. Changing circumstances, accumulating discontent, intellectual challenge, technological change. The simple wearing away of systems that no longer serve their original purpose. And yet, in another sense, these systems did not entirely disappear. Many of the institutions of medieval Europe were reformed rather than abolished. Guilds did not disappear entirely. In some form they persisted, providing community and structure for craftspeople even as their monopolistic powers were curtailed. Feudal obligations were formally abolished, but certain aspects of feudal hierarchy and deference persisted in cultural forms. The permanent structures were modified, reformed, reshaped, but traces of them remained, embedded in language, in law, in social customs, in the very architecture of European cities. And here is perhaps the final paradox in our journey. The permanent was broken, but it was not entirely erased. The temporary that became permanent eventually gave way to something different, but that something different often contained echoes of what had come before. The past, once it has been embedded in institutions and customs and physical structures, never entirely disappears. It is modified, reinterpreted, sometimes consciously rejected, but the traces remain. A European city in 1800 looks different from a medieval city. The guilds have lost their power. Feudal obligations are gone, yet the medieval streets remain. The medieval walls, though they no longer serve a defensive function, are still there. The guild halls have been repurposed, but they still stand. The layout of the city, determined by temporary decisions made centuries earlier, still shapes how people move through space. And so, in a final twist of irony, the temporary that became permanent was eventually superseded by something new, yet the physical remnants of the temporary persist, shaping the present even after the systems that created them have been dismantled. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of all, that nothing is truly permanent, yet nothing is truly forgotten. The temporary hardens into permanence, but permanence eventually yields to change. Yet the past, once embedded in the world, continues to shape the present, continues to constrain possibilities, continues to echo through time. The medieval emergency measures that became permanent structures shaped Europe for centuries. When they finally began to dissolve, they were replaced by new systems, new structures, new institutions. Yet the world we inhabit today still bears the marks of those medieval decisions. In the layout of our cities, in the remnants of institutions that once controlled our work, in the hierarchies and inequalities that persist despite formal abolition of feudalism and guilds. The temporary became permanent. The permanent eventually changed. Yet the traces remain, invisible but powerful, shaping the present in ways we often do not notice, reminding us that history is not something that happened long ago and is now irrelevant. History is woven into the very streets we walk on, the institutions we inhabit, the systems that structure our lives. We have journeyed together through centuries of medieval history, following a curious thread, the things that were meant to be temporary, but became permanent. We have walked through markets and guild halls, observed the rhythms of peasant and lord, traced the persistence of taxes and obligations, examined the stones and streets that still define our cities, and through it all, we have encountered a pattern that repeats again and again. The temporary, through the accumulated weight of habit and circumstance and human inertia, becomes permanent. It is perhaps natural to ask, as we near the end of this journey, what we should make of this pattern. What does it tell us about history, about human nature, about the world we inhabit? One answer is cautionary. The medieval permanent structures that we have examined, the guilds, the feudal obligations, the city walls, the market restrictions, created inequalities, constrained possibilities, perpetuated hierarchies that often seemed unjust even to people living under them. They were sometimes necessary, sometimes useful, but they also caused suffering, limited opportunity, and entrenched power in the hands of those who benefited from them. The fact that these temporary solutions became permanent is partly a cautionary tale. Be careful what temporary measures you create, for they may outlast their justification and become obstacles to progress. And yet, there is something else in this pattern as well, something more subtle and perhaps more important. The permanence of temporary medieval measures tells us something profound about how human societies actually function, as opposed to how we might wish them to function. We often imagine that institutions are created deliberately, through careful planning and rational deliberation. We imagine that societies are shaped by great historical figures making momentous decisions. But the history we have traced suggests something different. Many of our most enduring institutions were not carefully planned. They were not created by visionary leaders pursuing grand designs. Instead, they emerged from practical responses to immediate problems. They hardened into permanence through the simple accumulation of habit and inertia. They became embedded in law and custom and architecture through processes so gradual that no one noticed them happening. This suggests something important about how change actually happens in human societies. Change rarely comes from rational deliberation alone. It comes from the slow wearing away of systems that no longer serve their purpose. It comes from the accumulated resentment of people living under systems that constrain them. It comes from technological changes that undermine the foundations of existing institutions. It comes from the simple fact that as generations pass and historical memory fades, the justifications for permanent systems become increasingly difficult to articulate and defend. In the medieval world we have explored, change eventually came. The feudal system that seemed immutable for 5 centuries eventually gave way. The guilds that seemed permanent lost their power. Yet this change did not happen through a single decisive moment. It happened through centuries of slow pressure, gradual erosion, intellectual challenge, and the eventual recognition that what had seemed permanent was actually contingent, human-made, subject to alteration. And there is comfort in this, perhaps. It suggests that permanence is never quite as permanent as it seems. The systems that constrain us, that seem immovable, that feel like facts of nature rather than human choices, are ultimately subject to change. They may persist for centuries, they may seem unshakable, but they are always, in the end, subject to the same forces that created them: human decision, human pressure, human possibility. At the same time, there is a kind of melancholy in this recognition, for it suggests that nothing we build lasts forever. The permanent structures we create will eventually be superseded. The institutions we invest in will eventually decay or be reformed. The world we know will be transformed by forces we cannot fully control or predict. There is something poignant about realizing that the medieval people who built the guild halls and city walls, who established the feudal hierarchies and market restrictions, believed they were creating permanent order. Yet all of it eventually changed, and what we build today will eventually change as well. Perhaps this is why the theme of the temporary becoming permanent resonates so deeply with us. It speaks to something fundamental about the human condition, our desire for stability and permanence, combined with our awareness that everything eventually changes. We create systems hoping they will last forever, yet we know, or we sense, that they will not. We build institutions intending them as temporary solutions, yet we find ourselves living within them for generations. We create structures, physical, social, institutional, and then discover that we are trapped within those structures, unable to easily change them, yet also unable to fully accept them. The medieval permanent structures we have explored were not evil, though they caused suffering. They were not irrational, though they often became obstacles to progress. They were simply human, imperfect attempts to solve problems, to create order, to establish stability in an uncertain world. And like all human attempts, they had consequences that extended far beyond what anyone intended. This brings us to a final thought, as we prepare to close our journey through medieval history, the recognition that we, too, are creating the permanence of the future. The temporary measures we create today, the policies we establish, the institutions we build, the structures we embed in law and custom, may well become the permanent systems of the future. The emergency measures implemented today may be the constraints that bind future generations. The temporary solutions we create to immediate problems may shape the world for centuries to come. This is not a reason for despair, but it is a reason for thoughtfulness. It is a reason to consider the long-term consequences of short-term decisions. It is a reason to examine the systems we take for granted, to question whether they still serve their original purpose, to recognize that the permanent structures around us are human creations, subject to alteration, and perhaps most importantly, it is a reason to recognize that history is not something that happened long ago and is now irrelevant. The past is not past. It persists in the institutions we inhabit, the streets we walk on, the systems that structure our lives. The medieval decisions that created permanent systems continue to shape our world, and the decisions we make today will continue to shape the world for generations yet to come. As you settle more deeply into rest, into the quiet spaces between waking and sleep, you might reflect on this pattern: the temporary becoming permanent, the permanent eventually changing, the cycle continuing, across centuries and generations, shaping lives, constraining possibilities, creating the world in which people live. In medieval cities, people lived within structures they did not create. constrained by obligations they did not choose, navigating systems that seemed permanent and inevitable, yet which, over time, gave way to something different. In our world, too, we live within structures, constrained by systems, navigating a world shaped by decisions made before we were born. Perhaps the only permanence is change itself. Perhaps the only certainty is that what seems immovable will eventually move. Perhaps the only wisdom is to recognize both the power and the fragility of the systems we create, both the necessity and the temporary nature of the structures that order our lives. Let yourself drift now, deeper into the quiet spaces. The medieval world recedes, the stories settle, the facts fade gently into the background, but something remains, the recognition that history is always with us, always shaping us, always reminding us that what we take for granted is merely temporary, merely contingent, merely human. The temporary becomes permanent. The permanent becomes history, and history, patient and vast, continues on, shaped by countless small decisions, countless temporary measures, countless human attempts to solve immediate problems, never quite knowing that what we build today will constrain or define what comes tomorrow. Rest now. Let these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, gentle and gradual, reshaping the landscape beneath the surface, invisible but permanent. The medieval world, with all its permanence and change, has given us its lessons. And we, in our time, are simply the inheritors of what the past has left behind. Sleep well. Tomorrow is already being shaped by today's temporary decisions. But for now, rest. Let your mind drift back through the centuries, through the guild halls and market squares, through the feudal obligations and city walls, through the slow accumulation of the temporary into the permanent. Let the rhythm of medieval life, with all its patterns and constraints and human attempts at order, lull you gently toward sleep. The temporary becomes permanent, the permanent eventually changes, and the story continues, eternal and ever-shifting, in the depths of human history, in the stones of our cities, in the structures that order our lives, waiting only for you to close your eyes and drift away.